On the night of September 14th, 1974, Mississippi, 11 men entered a tobacco warehouse building for what they thought would be another routine Saturday night poker game. None of them walked out alive. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs, weren't organized crime families, weren't even strangers seeking random violence. They were two brothers from a local farming family who had reached a breaking point that would transform them from decent men into cold-blooded executioners. The Mississippi Delta in 1974 was a place where time seemed to move differently than the rest of America. Yazoo County stretched across nearly 1,000 square miles of flat farmland, cotton fields, and small towns that existed in the spaces between highways. The population barely reached 27,000 souls, scattered across communities where everyone knew your business before you did, where the nearest hospital required an hour-long drive, and where Saturday night entertainment often meant gathering in converted barns or abandoned warehouses for illegal gambling. September brought temperatures that still hovered in the 80s well past sunset, with humidity so thick you could practically chew the air. The smell of turned earth mixed with distant wood smoke from farmers burning off their fields created an atmosphere that was uniquely southern, uniquely rural, and uniquely isolated from the oversight of federal law enforcement. This was a world where handshake agreements still carried weight, where your reputation meant everything, and where the wrong kind of debt could destroy not just your finances but your entire family legacy. In this environment, underground gambling wasn't just entertainment for bored farmers and mechanics. It represented a shadow economy that operated parallel to legitimate business, providing opportunities for men whose regular jobs barely covered their expenses to potentially change their circumstances with a single good night at the tables. The games ran every weekend in locations that rotated to avoid detection, overseen by men with connections to what locals called the Dixie Mafia, that loose confederation of Southern criminals who made their Northern counterparts look organized by comparison. The biggest regular game in Yazoo County operated out of Turner's Warehouse on County Road 49, a structure that had once housed tobacco crops but now served as the weekly gathering place for men seeking fortune or escape from their daily struggles. Every Saturday night, stakes ran high enough to matter, but not so high as to attract unwanted federal attention. This was where working men could lose their truck payments, or win enough to catch up on their mortgages, where reputation and word of honor supposedly still meant something in an increasingly cynical world. James Lee Carter had recently turned 34, though the hard years of farm work and military service had aged him beyond his chronological years. Standing just over 6 feet tall with the lean build of a man who worked with his hands, he carried visible reminders of his service in Vietnam, including a scar through his left eyebrow where shrapnel had missed ending his life by less than an inch. He had returned from Southeast Asia with a Purple Heart, nightmares he never discussed, and a fundamental belief that the world made sense if you followed the rules and kept your promises. Every morning found James maintaining the same ritual he had followed for years, rising before dawn to make coffee in the same percolator his mother had used, sitting on the back porch to watch sunrise break over the soybean fields while smoking 2 cigarettes and planning his day. He worked as a handyman and mechanic, the kind of man who could fix nearly anything if given enough time and the right tools, living in the small farmhouse his grandfather had constructed in 1923. The house also sheltered his father, Samuel, who at 68 was slowly dying from emphysema contracted during 43 years of working at the local cotton gin. Each breath represented a struggle for the old man, whose days were spent in a chair by the window, with an oxygen tank hissing beside him like some mechanical guardian. Samuel had worked his entire adult life breathing dust that had accumulated in his lungs like concrete, and now the medical bills from his condition were consuming what little savings the family had managed to accumulate over the decades. James had married young, right before shipping out to Vietnam, but that marriage hadn't survived his return from combat. By 1974, he lived alone with his dying father, maintaining the property and working whatever jobs he could find to keep the household functioning. What James valued above all else wasn't money, which had always been scarce, but respect and honor, concepts his father and grandfather had taught him, represented the true measure of a man's worth. Robert Franklin Carter, known to everyone as Bobby, was 5 years younger than his brother, but in many ways remained the kid who had followed James everywhere since learning to walk. At 29, Bobby stood slightly shorter than James, with a stockier build developed through years working as a mechanic at Johnson's garage on Highway 49. His round face made him appear younger than his actual age, and his quick smile had helped him navigate social situations throughout his life. Bobby had married Rita McKinney in 1970, and they had produced a son named Samuel Jr., called Sammy, who represented the light of Bobby's existence. The family lived in a rented house 2 miles from the Carter family farm, close enough that Bobby visited every evening after work to help James with whatever needed doing and check on their ailing father. The loyalty between the brothers ran deeper than blood, forged in childhood and hardened by shared knowledge that they only had each other in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to men like them. Both brothers had become regulars at the Saturday night poker games at Turner's Warehouse, where they had been playing for nearly 2 years. James approached gambling with the same methodical patience he brought to mechanical work, able to read other players the way some people read books, while Bobby played with the reckless enthusiasm of a man who believed luck could change everything with a single hand. Together, they were known quantities at the table, men who paid their losses and collected their winnings without drama or complaint. This reputation had brought them into contact with Lester Haynes, universally known as Lucky, who served as the organizer and unofficial host of the weekly games. At 41, Lucky had never worked what anyone would consider an honest day in his life, wearing that fact like a badge of honor that separated him from the farmers and mechanics who made up his regular clientele. He stood about average height but had gone soft around the middle, maintaining slicked-back hair that he dyed jet black to hide the advancing gray, and sporting a smile that belonged on a used car salesman moments before, closing a deal on a vehicle with a cracked engine block. Lucky dressed in a style that stood out dramatically in rural Yazoo County, favoring polyester suits in shades of brown and tan, wide-collar shirts that reflected the fashion trends of the era, and platform shoes that added crucial inches to his height. Gold rings decorated every finger, and he applied English leather cologne with such a heavy hand that his presence could be detected from across a room. He drove a pale yellow Cadillac Eldorado with a white vinyl top that he parked prominently wherever he went, ensuring that everyone understood his financial success. The warehouse games operated under Lucky's supervision, though he didn't own the building itself. That belonged to Horace Turner, who had stopped growing tobacco in 1968 and rented the space to whoever could meet his modest asking price. Lucky's role involved organizing the weekly gatherings, inviting the players, handling the money, and taking his percentage off the top of every pot. His connections to the Dixie Mafia provided the games with protection, ensuring that local law enforcement looked the other way, and that players could walk to their vehicles afterward without fear of robbery. Lucky maintained a wife named Sharon, 38 years old, and 2 teenage daughters in a brick ranch house on what passed for the nice side of Yazoo City. His lifestyle required constant demonstration of success, needing everyone to see his money and recognize his status, even though that success was built on taking percentages from desperate men betting money they couldn't afford to lose on cards that might or might not fall in their favor. For 18 months, Lucky Haynes and Samuel Carter had been conducting what Lucky described as business, but what Samuel understood as a lifeline. The exact details remained unclear to James and Bobby, but the basic outline was simple enough to follow. Samuel needed money for mounting medical bills. Lucky claimed he could help through a friend who made private loans with easy terms and no complicated questions. Samuel signed the necessary papers, money changed hands, and somewhere in that seemingly straightforward transaction, Lucky had done what Lucky always did. He had found an angle that benefited him more than anyone else involved. The explosion came on a Friday afternoon in early September when James was working under the hood of his truck, replacing a fuel pump that had finally surrendered after 140,000 miles of Delta roads. He heard his father's scream from inside the house. Not a yell or shout, but the kind of sound a man makes when something fundamental breaks inside his chest. Running into the kitchen, James found Samuel standing with a letter clutched in his trembling hands, his face the color of old newspaper, his breathing coming in irregular gasps that suggested his heart was struggling to maintain its rhythm. The letter bore the letterhead of a law office in Jackson, filled with legal language that James had to read multiple times before understanding its meaning. Samuel Carter's land, all 180 acres that had belonged to the family since his grandfather's homesteading in 1919, had been signed over to Lester C. Haynes as payment for a debt of $12,300. The transfer was legal, the deed was recorded, and the land was gone. Samuel had trusted Lucky because they knew each other from the poker games, because men who sat at the same table were supposed to look out for one another, because in Yazoo County a handshake was supposed to mean something. But Lucky had structured the loan with terms that made default inevitable, creating automatic land transfer when Samuel couldn't meet payments that had been designed to be impossible from the beginning. James called for an ambulance as his father collapsed into a kitchen chair, clutching his chest while the oxygen tank hissed uselessly beside him. The paramedics arrived within 20 minutes, loading Samuel onto a stretcher and disappearing down County Road 49, with lights flashing and sirens cutting through the afternoon heat. At the hospital, after doctors had stabilized him and moved him to a room filled with machines that beeped and monitored every vital sign, Samuel told his sons the complete story. Lucky had approached him 18 months earlier, when the medical bills were mounting beyond control, presenting what seemed like a simple solution to an impossible problem. $8,500 at 15% interest, due in 12 months, with the land deed serving as collateral that Lucky assured him would never actually be needed. Banks required such formalities, Lucky had explained with that salesman's smile, but no way would it ever come to actual forfeiture. Samuel had signed papers he couldn't read properly, trusting a man who attended the same weekly games, who seemed successful and connected, who spoke with the confidence of someone who understood legal matters. But when the payments came due and Samuel couldn't meet them because hospital bills were consuming every dollar the family could generate, the land transferred automatically according to terms buried in legal language the old farmer had never understood. The Carter family land was gone, stolen through paperwork and legal manipulation that transformed trust into theft. James and Bobby sat in the hospital parking lot until after midnight, not talking, just existing in the humid darkness while crickets sang their endless songs and occasional vehicles passed on the distant highway. Finally, Bobby broke the silence with words that would set everything in motion. The conversation that followed would later be reconstructed by FBI investigators as the moment when two ordinary men began their transformation into something else entirely. James had served 13 months in Vietnam, learning skills the Army had spent considerable time and money teaching him, skills he had buried deep upon returning home, trying to forget them while attempting to build a normal life as a mechanic and farmer and dutiful son. But some knowledge never truly disappears, just waits dormant until circumstances call it back to life. On that September night in a hospital parking lot that smelled like asphalt and diesel fuel, those combat skills awakened. The week between Samuel's heart attack and the next Saturday moved with the strange, slow quality of a fever dream, where you know something terrible is approaching but feel powerless to prevent it. James spent Monday morning at the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office, sitting across from Sheriff Tom Beckworth and explaining the situation with the calm precision of a man who had already accepted what the response would be. Beckworth listened with the weary expression of someone who had heard similar stories many times before, leaning back in his chair until it creaked while James detailed Lucky's fraud, the predatory loan terms, and the legal theft of everything his family had built over 3 generations. When James finished, the sheriff delivered exactly the response that had been expected. This was a civil matter requiring lawyers rather than law enforcement. Lucky Haynes paid his taxes, followed the law mostly, and had friends who would make Beckworth's life difficult if he started investigating without concrete evidence. The best advice the sheriff could offer was to forget about the land and move forward with their lives. James walked out of that office knowing he had exhausted every legal option, proving to himself that he had tried to handle the situation through proper channels before considering alternatives that existed outside the boundaries of civilized society. Tuesday morning found James driving to Vicksburg, 50 miles south and far enough away that nobody would recognize him or ask uncomfortable questions about his purchases. The pawn shop on Washington Street provided exactly what he was looking for, wedged between a bail bondsman and a closed diner in a part of town where transactions were completed quickly and without excessive paperwork. Behind the counter, a man with tattooed forearms and suspicious eyes watched James examine the selection of firearms until he settled on a Colt 1911, Korean War surplus that showed wear but had been properly maintained. The pistol felt familiar in his hands, bringing back muscle memory from training that had occurred in another lifetime, in another version of himself that had believed the world made sense according to rules that everyone followed. The purchase was legal and traceable, requiring identification and paperwork that would eventually lead investigators directly back to him. Some part of James's mind registered this fact, understanding that he was creating evidence that would destroy any possibility of avoiding consequences, but he no longer cared about getting away with anything. This wasn't about escape or self-preservation, but about making things right according to a code that predated any law written in Jackson or Washington. Wednesday brought a visit to his father's hospital room, where Samuel lay connected to tubes and machines that monitored his declining condition. The old man's face had acquired the gray, papery quality of someone who had used up most of his allotted days, but his eyes remained clear and focused when James sat beside his bed. Samuel gripped his son's wrist with surprising strength, his voice barely audible through the oxygen mask as he spoke words that would haunt James for the rest of his life. The dying man could see something in his son's expression that reminded him of his own father decades earlier, a look that appeared on men's faces when they had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits and were contemplating actions that could never be undone. Samuel wanted to extract a promise that James would let the matter rest, would accept the loss and move forward rather than pursuing vengeance that would destroy what remained of their family. But James had never lied to his father, and wasn't prepared to start during what might be their final conversation. Lucky Haynes had stolen everything they had built, robbing them with legal documents and that practiced smile, while the law declared such theft perfectly acceptable. Some things couldn't be walked away from, some violations of trust demanded response, and some debts could only be settled through means that courts and lawyers would never understand. Samuel closed his eyes as a tear ran down his weathered cheek, understanding that his son had already made an irreversible decision. He whispered instructions about keeping Bobby out of whatever was planned, reminding James that his younger brother had a wife and son who needed him, but they both knew that Bobby would make his own choices regardless of anyone's preferences. That evening, Bobby arrived at the farmhouse to find maps of Yazoo County spread across the kitchen table, alongside boxes of ammunition and a pistol wrapped in brown paper. The sight told him everything he needed to know about his brother's intentions, and when James offered him the opportunity to walk away, to maintain his distance from what was being planned, Bobby's response came without hesitation. He reminded James of an incident from their childhood when older boys had beaten Bobby so severely he couldn't see out of his left eye for a week. James had retaliated by putting both attackers in the hospital, getting suspended from school, and costing their father money for medical bills, but he had done it anyway, because that was what brothers did for each other. They didn't allow family to be hurt without consequences, regardless of what those consequences might cost them personally. The two men spent the following hours mapping locations and discussing logistics with the methodical precision of soldiers planning a military operation. Turner's warehouse on County Road 49, the route from there to Highway 49, back roads that could serve as alternates, distance from the nearest sheriff's substation, estimated response time if someone managed to call for help. Everything was documented and rehearsed until both brothers understood exactly what would happen and when. By Thursday evening, the plan was complete, and the decision had been made. James and Bobby Carter, two ordinary men who had been pushed past the breaking point by a system that protected predators while grinding down decent families, were about to cross a line that would transform them into something unrecognizable. The Saturday night poker game at Turner's warehouse would proceed as scheduled. Lucky Haynes would be there along with his regular players, and the Carter brothers would finally collect on a debt that had been accumulating interest in blood and humiliation for 18 months. Friday passed in a strange state of suspended animation, with both brothers going through the motions of normal life, while knowing that everything was about to change forever. Bobby spent the evening at home with Rita and Sammy, watching his son play with toy trucks and trying to memorize every detail of ordinary family happiness that he was about to sacrifice. James sat on the farmhouse porch, drinking beer and watching darkness settle over the soybean fields, making peace with the version of himself that was about to die along with everyone else in that warehouse. Saturday morning dawned clear and hot, with the sun rising over Yazoo County exactly as it had done every morning since the beginning of time, indifferent to human plans and human suffering. James woke at his usual time, made his coffee, smoked his 2 cigarettes, and went through his normal routine while knowing that by this time tomorrow he would either be dead or in custody, having crossed a boundary that no decent person should ever cross. At 8:47 that evening, as shadows lengthened across the delta and the temperature finally began its slow descent towards something approaching comfortable, James and Bobby Carter climbed into James's pickup truck. The vehicle was a 1968 Ford F-100, dark green with a cracked windshield and over 140,000 miles on the odometer, carrying in its bed the instruments of what was about to unfold. Wrapped carefully in canvas were the weapons they had assembled. The Colt .45 from the Vicksburg pawn shop, Bobby's hunting rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun borrowed from their cousin who hadn't asked questions about why they needed it. The drive to County Road 49 passed in silence, both men lost in their own thoughts as familiar landmarks slipped past the windows. These were roads they had traveled their entire lives, past farms where they had worked summer jobs as teenagers, past the church where they had been baptized, past the cemetery where their grandparents lay buried beneath headstones weathered by decades of Mississippi heat and rain. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, yet everything was different because of what they were about to do. Turner's warehouse sat 200 yards off the main road, a converted tobacco barn with rusted metal siding and a single bare bulb hanging over the entrance. Light leaked through cracks in the walls, and the sound of men's voices carried on the night air, punctuated by laughter, the shuffle of cards, and the clink of beer bottles. Inside, 8 men had gathered around their makeshift poker table, completely unaware that death was approaching in a green Ford pickup truck driven by men they had known for years. James parked the vehicle and sat with his hands wrapped around the steering wheel, feeling his heartbeat settle into the same steady rhythm he remembered from Vietnam when waiting for orders to advance. This was the final moment when they could still turn back, drive home, forget this madness, and accept their loss like civilized men were supposed to do. But the image of his father lying in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive while his heart slowly gave up, made retreat impossible. The warehouse door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the humid night air. 8 men looked up from their cards as James and Bobby entered, confusion flickering across their faces before transforming into understanding and then terror as they saw the weapons. Lucky Haynes sat with his back to the door, wearing a tan suit jacket despite the heat, gold rings catching the light as his hands froze above his cards. Deputy Marcus Webb occupied the chair to Lucky's right, still in uniform with his service revolver resting on the table beside his beer bottle. The other 6 players were local men, farmers and mechanics whom James had known for years, men who had been part of his community and should have been his allies rather than witnesses to his family's destruction. They had laughed when Lucky bragged about his latest acquisition, had sat at this same table while he described how easy it had been to separate an old farmer from his land. The first shot came at 9:51, echoing through the warehouse like thunder, while Marcus Webb fell backward from his chair, his hand never quite reaching his weapon. The sound seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before being replaced by the chaos of men scrambling for exits that Bobby had already secured. Vernon Tucker made a desperate run for the front door, but fell before reaching it, his body hitting the concrete floor with the sound of finality. What followed was not a gunfight, but an execution, methodical and thorough, as James and Bobby moved through the warehouse with the efficiency of men who had planned every detail. Dale Morrison tried to reason with them, reminding James of their shared history, of harvest seasons when they had helped each other, of the wedding where Dale had served as a groomsman. But shared history meant nothing when weighed against the destruction of everything James held sacred. The warehouse filled with gun smoke, and the copper smell of blood as bodies accumulated on the concrete floor. Each shot represented not just a life ended, but a choice made, a line crossed, a piece of their humanity sacrificed on the altar of what they believed was justice. Tommy Briggs begged for mercy, reminding them of his work alongside Bobby at the garage, of lunch breaks shared and stories told. But mercy was a luxury they had abandoned when legal channels failed them. Carl Hendricks stood tall even when facing the inevitable, looking at James with something that might have been pity rather than fear. He spoke about the good man James had once been, the veteran who had returned from war and tried to build something decent in a world that seemed determined to tear down anything worthwhile. But that man was already dead, killed by a system that protected predators while crushing the innocent, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. Ray Sutton dropped to his knees and pleaded for his life, speaking of his 3 daughters who needed their father, of a wife who sang in the church choir, of a feed store that provided honest work for honest pay. His tears mixed with the sawdust on the floor as James explained with terrible calm that evil won when good men did nothing, that every person in that room had enabled Lucky's corruption through their silence and complicity. By 10:33, the warehouse had been transformed from a place of weekly gathering into a charnel house where 8 bodies lay scattered across concrete stained with blood that would never completely wash away. The silence that followed the final shot was broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the settling of old wood that had witnessed too much violence for one night. But the killing wasn't finished. As James and Bobby prepared to leave, 3 more men arrived in the parking area outside, late arrivals who had been sleeping in their car while waiting for the game to thin out. Jerry Coleman had driven in from Yazoo City with his nephew Michael Dunn and Patrick Walsh, thinking they would join the poker game for a few hands before heading home to their families. They woke to see 2 men emerging from the warehouse carrying weapons, their clothes stained with blood, their faces bearing expressions that spoke of lines crossed and souls lost. Recognition dawned in Jerry's eyes as he understood what had happened inside that building, and he screamed for the others to run, knowing even as he did so that there was nowhere to go on that empty stretch of County Road 49. Patrick Walsh made it 15 yards into the cotton fields before Bobby's rifle found him, his body falling face first into earth that smelled of fertilizer and approaching rain. Michael Dunn ran toward the tree line with the desperate speed of youth, his 18-year-old legs pumping frantically as he fought for a life that had barely begun. He might have made it to safety if his foot hadn't caught on a root, sending him sprawling in the dirt while James approached with the methodical pace of inevitability. The boy looked up at James with eyes wide with terror and incomprehension, pleading for mercy while trying to understand what he had stumbled into. James saw his own sons in that young face, saw every teenager who had ever been caught in circumstances beyond their control, and felt something crack inside his chest. But mercy was a luxury he had abandoned hours earlier, and the boy became the 10th victim of a night that had already claimed too many lives. Jerry Coleman had run toward the warehouse, thinking perhaps he could barricade himself inside or find some means of escape, but James caught him at the door. Standing with his back against the metal siding, nowhere left to flee, Jerry tried one final appeal to the humanity he hoped still existed somewhere inside the man he had known for 15 years. He offered to testify that it had been self-defense, that Lucky had drawn first, that anything was better than becoming the 11th victim of a massacre that would haunt Yazoo County for generations. But James no longer wanted escape or exoneration. This wasn't about avoiding consequences, but about sending a message that some violations of trust would not go unpunished, that some men would not accept destruction quietly, that there were still people willing to enforce codes of honor that the law had forgotten. Jerry Coleman fell at 10:52, the final name on a list written in blood and vengeance across the Mississippi Delta. The warehouse stood silent now except for the hum of that single bulb still burning over the entrance, casting harsh light across a scene that would become the subject of FBI investigation and national news coverage. 11 men lay dead inside and around a building that had once housed tobacco crops, and now housed only ghosts and the lingering smell of gunpowder. James and Bobby Carter stood in the parking area, surrounded by the evidence of what they had become, carrying weapons that had transformed them from farmers into executioners. The drive home passed like a fever dream, familiar roads taking on an alien quality now that everything had changed. They spoke not a word during the 20-minute journey back to the farmhouse, each man lost in contemplation of what they had done and what would surely follow. The weight of 11 lives pressed down on them like a physical thing, heavier than anything they had carried in Vietnam or on the farm or anywhere else in their previous existence. At the Carter farmhouse, they placed their weapons on the kitchen table where their family had shared thousands of meals, where their father had taught them the difference between right and wrong, where they had planned this night of violence with the methodical precision of men who believed they had no other choice. The house smelled like coffee and old wood and normalcy, everything exactly as they had left it, yet nothing would ever be the same. Bobby called Rita from the phone on the wall, his hand shaking as he tried to explain what could not be explained, telling his wife that he loved her and asking her to help Sammy understand that his father had tried to do the right thing even when right looked exactly like wrong. His voice broke as he spoke, the weight of consequences finally settling on shoulders that had carried his rifle through the warehouse but now trembled under the burden of what came next. James walked out onto the back porch and sat in his father's chair, lighting a cigarette with hands that had remained steady while taking 11 lives, but now shook with the magnitude of what he had become. The night air carried the scent of turned earth and distant rain that might never come, while crickets sang their endless song of indifference to human tragedy. somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out with lonely insistence, and the world continued its ancient rotation regardless of the blood that had been spilled in its name. The hours that followed passed with agonizing slowness, as both brothers sat on that porch, waiting for dawn and the inevitable arrival of law enforcement officers who would end their brief careers as agents of their own justice. They spoke occasionally of childhood memories, of summers that had lasted forever, of a time when the world had seemed simpler and honor had seemed like something worth dying for. At 6:47 the following morning, a truck driver passing on County Road 49 would discover the bodies and radio for help, setting in motion the machinery of federal investigation that would eventually surround their farmhouse with armed officers and helicopters and the full weight of American justice. But for now, they simply sat in the darkness, two brothers who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, carrying the weight of 11 lives and knowing that everything they had ever been was ending with the approaching dawn. Dawn. At 6:47 Sunday morning, Willie Jameson was making his regular haul from Memphis to New Orleans when he spotted something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The veteran truck driver had been running these Delta routes for over 2 decades, knew every back road and shortcut between the Mississippi River and Highway 61. He was behind schedule after a blown tire outside Jackson and had decided to cut through County Road 49 to make up time. The morning sun painted the sky in soft pastels as Willie rolled his 18-wheeler past cotton fields still heavy with dew. Gospel music drifted from his radio while he thought about the breakfast waiting at the truck stop in Yazoo City. Then his eyes registered something that his brain initially refused to process. Bodies scattered across the gravel parking area of Turner's warehouse like broken dolls thrown by an angry child. Willie slammed his brakes and pulled onto the shoulder, his hands suddenly trembling on the steering wheel. 23 years of driving had shown him plenty of accidents, but this was different. These men weren't positioned like accident victims. They lay at angles that spoke of violence, of deliberate action, of death delivered with purpose and precision. Against every instinct screaming at him to drive away and pretend he had seen nothing, Willie climbed down from his cab and approached the warehouse. The smell hit him before he reached the building, that distinctive copper tang of spilled blood mixed with gunpowder and fear. Through the open door, he could see additional bodies scattered across the concrete floor, and Willie Jameson, veteran of the Korean conflict and father of 4, turned away and vomited into the Mississippi dirt. His CB radio crackled to life as he stumbled back to his truck, his voice breaking as he tried to explain the unexplainable to the dispatcher. 11 dead, maybe more, at Turner's warehouse on County Road 49. Send everyone, send the sheriff, send the FBI, send anyone who could make sense of what looked like a war zone in the middle of rural Mississippi. The first official response came from Deputy Sarah Mitchell at the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office, a young woman who had been handling routine calls about livestock on highways and domestic disputes until her radio exploded with Willie's panicked transmission. She immediately contacted Sheriff Tom Beckworth at his home, knowing that whatever had happened on County Road 49 was beyond anything their small department had ever encountered. Sheriff Beckworth arrived at the scene 18 minutes later, his patrol car kicking up dust as he pulled into the warehouse parking area. At 56 years old, he had worn the badge for 11 years and believed he had seen every variety of Delta violence the region could produce. Bar fights that turned fatal, domestic situations that ended in tragedy, the occasional drug deal that went sideways. But standing in that gravel lot, looking at 3 bodies sprawled in unnatural positions, Beckworth understood immediately that this was something entirely different. Willie Jameson sat on the running board of his truck, pale as morning fog, rocking back and forth while staring at nothing. When Beckworth asked how many victims they were dealing with, The trucker simply held up both hands with fingers spread, unable to speak the number that would transform this from a local tragedy into a federal investigation. The sheriff approached the warehouse with the careful steps of a man who had served in Vietnam and recognized the aftermath of systematic killing. The morning sun illuminated the scene with merciless clarity, revealing details that would be burned into his memory forever. Inside the converted tobacco barn, 8 additional bodies lay scattered across concrete that would never be clean again, surrounded by overturned furniture, scattered money, and the detritus of what had been a routine Saturday night gathering. Shell casings littered the floor like deadly confetti, speaking of multiple weapons and methodical execution rather than chaotic gunfight. The poker table had been overturned, cards scattered like leaves, but this hadn't been a robbery. Money remained visible throughout the scene, abandoned by killers who had come for something more valuable than cash. Beckworth keyed his radio with hands that remained steady through decades of training, requesting immediate FBI assistance for what he described as multiple homicides with federal implications. The scope and precision of the violence demanded resources beyond anything Yazoo County could provide. Expertise in mass casualty events that small-town law enforcement simply didn't possess. While Sheriff Beckworth documented the carnage with professional detachment that masked his inner turmoil. 3 miles away, Rita Carter was preparing Sunday breakfast for Sammy. Scrambled eggs and toast, orange juice in his favorite cartoon character cup, the comfortable routine of family life proceeding exactly as it had for years. She had heard Bobby return home late the previous night, heard him speaking in low tones with James on the back porch, but farm life meant irregular hours, and she hadn't questioned his absence. The radio played country music while Rita hummed along and cleaned egg from Sammy's face. Dolly Parton sang about lost love while morning sunlight streamed through kitchen windows, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that would be shattered within hours. Sammy asked when they could visit Grandpa Samuel at the hospital, and Rita promised they would go after church services, never imagining that Bobby would never accompany them anywhere again. FBI Special Agent Harold Briggs received the call at his Jackson office at 9:30 Sunday morning, interrupting his review of case files with news that would dominate the next several months of his career. At 52 years old, with 26 years of federal service, Briggs had investigated everything from bank robberies to civil rights murders, including some of the Klan violence that had turned Mississippi into a battleground during the previous decade. But as Briggs drove north toward Yazoo County, listening to radio updates that described 11 victims and evidence of military-style planning, he recognized that this case would be different from anything in his experience. This wasn't ideological violence or random criminal activity. The precision described by local law enforcement suggested personal motivation, careful preparation, and killers who had approached their task with the methodical efficiency of soldiers completing a mission. The warehouse scene confirmed Briggs's initial assessment. Multiple weapons, coordinated timing, systematic elimination of witnesses. These weren't drug dealers settling territorial disputes or robbers whose plans had gone wrong. The evidence spoke of calculated revenge, of men who had planned extensively and executed their plan with military precision. Sheriff Beckworth provided the crucial context that transformed the investigation from mystery to manhunt. James Carter had visited his office the previous Monday morning, seeking law enforcement intervention in what he claimed was fraudulent theft of his family's land. Beckworth had explained that civil matters required lawyers rather than sheriffs, suggesting that Carter pursue legal remedies through proper channels. 5 days later, 11 men lay dead in circumstances that suggested Carter had decided to pursue his own form of justice. The loan documents and deed transfer papers told the story of predatory lending practices that had stripped an elderly farmer of everything his family had built across 3 generations. Legal theft disguised as legitimate business, protected by paperwork that made prosecution impossible and civil recovery unlikely. Briggs studied the evidence with the trained eye of someone who had seen humanity's capacity for both evil and justice become hopelessly intertwined. This was revenge, certainly, but revenge motivated by systematic fraud that the legal system had been powerless to address. Understanding the motivation didn't excuse the violence, but it explained why 11 families would wake Monday morning to discover that their lives had been destroyed by men who believed they had been left with no other options. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal resources poured into rural Mississippi. Forensics teams from Jackson processed every inch of the warehouse, documenting evidence with photographic precision that would eventually fill dozens of file boxes. Ballistics analysis confirmed the use of 3 distinct weapons: a .45 caliber pistol, a .30-06 hunting rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun. The .45 and hunting rifle were registered to James Lee Carter, purchased legally and traceable through federal databases that made hiding ownership impossible. The shotgun remained untraceable, likely borrowed from family or purchased through private sale, but its presence indicated planning that involved multiple participants and careful consideration of ammunition requirements. Timeline reconstruction revealed the massacre's methodical progression. The Carter brothers had arrived at approximately 9:47 Saturday evening, beginning their assault 4 minutes later when the first shots eliminated Deputy Marcus Webb. The killing had continued for nearly 2 hours, suggesting that victims had been questioned, threatened, or tortured before execution. But the breakthrough that transformed investigation into arrest warrant came when Deputy Sarah Mitchell discovered the financial records that explained everything. Samuel Carter's hospitalization on September 6th, admitted with chest pains immediately after learning that his land had been transferred to Lester Haynes through legal mechanisms that constituted fraud disguised as legitimate lending. The predatory loan structure became clear through careful examination of the paperwork. Deliberately confusing terms, automatic deed transfer upon default, payment schedules designed to ensure failure. Everything legal under Mississippi law, everything protected by contracts that Samuel Carter couldn't read properly, everything amounting to theft accomplished through documentation rather than violence. Agent Briggs read through the loan file with growing understanding of what had driven 2 ordinary farmers to become mass murderers. This wasn't about money or land ownership. This was about honor, about dignity, about watching a dying father lose everything to men who used legal paperwork as weapons against people who couldn't afford adequate representation. The community response revealed the moral complexity that would haunt Yazoo County for decades. At the Silver City Cafe, conversations erupted into arguments between those who condemned the Carter brothers as cold-blooded killers and others who understood the desperation that had driven them to violence. Martha Webb mourned her husband's death while simultaneously acknowledging that Marcus had taken Lucky's money to ignore illegal gambling operations. Old-timers who remembered the Depression spoke of times when men handled their own problems without involving distant authorities who didn't understand local conditions. They didn't condone mass murder, but they recognized the failure of systems that were supposed to protect honest families from predators who operated within legal boundaries. Pastor Eddie Hinton struggled through Sunday services at First Baptist Church, addressing a congregation split between families of victims and community members who quietly sympathized with the Carter brothers. His sermon asked questions that had no satisfying answers. Why had neighbors failed to help neighbors? Why couldn't law enforcement protect the innocent? Why had 11 men died over disputes that should have been resolved through proper channels? The arrest came Thursday afternoon, as federal and local law enforcement surrounded the Carter farmhouse with enough firepower to handle armed resistance from experienced combat veterans. Helicopters circled overhead, while tactical teams positioned themselves for what might become a violent confrontation between desperate men and overwhelming force. Instead, they found James and Bobby Carter sitting on the back porch, unarmed, and waiting with the calm resignation of men who had completed their mission and accepted whatever consequences would follow. No weapons were visible, no defensive preparations had been made, no attempt at flight or resistance, just two brothers who had crossed an irreversible line and were prepared to face justice according to someone else's definition. Sheriff Beckworth approached the porch alone, leaving the tactical teams in position while he walked up the same steps he had climbed years earlier during social visits to the Carter family. James stood slowly as Beckworth approached, moving like a man much older than his 34 years, aged by the weight of 11 lives and the knowledge that his own life was effectively over. The conversation was brief and professional. Beckworth explained the charges and the need for immediate surrender. James acknowledged understanding and confirmed that neither he nor Bobby would resist arrest. They had done what they believed necessary, and now they would face whatever judgment society chose to impose upon them. Bobby went inside to make one final phone call to Rita, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what could not be explained. He told her he loved her, asked her to help Sammy understand that his father had tried to protect the family honor, requested that she tell their son that sometimes good men are forced to do terrible things when all other options have been exhausted. The handcuffs clicked closed around James Carter's wrists at 4:47 Thursday afternoon, September 19, 1974. Sheriff Beckworth performed the arrest personally, reading rights to a man he had known for years, a veteran who had served his country honorably before circumstances pushed him beyond all reasonable limits. As they led the Carter brothers to separate patrol cars, James looked back at the farmhouse his grandfather had built, at the fields his family had worked for 3 generations, at everything he was losing forever. The land would eventually be sold to pay legal costs, the house would be abandoned, and the Carter name would become synonymous with the worst mass murder in Mississippi history. Agent Briggs watched the arrest with the complicated emotions of someone who understood both the horror of what had been done and the desperation that had motivated it. 11 families had been destroyed by men who believed the legal system had failed them completely, leaving violence as their only recourse against injustice disguised as legitimate business. The questions that would haunt everyone involved were simple and terrible. Had the Carter brothers been driven to justifiable violence by systematic fraud? Were they desperate men protecting family honor in a world that offered no legal protection? Or were they simply murderers who had dressed their crimes in the language of honor and justice? The federal courthouse in Jackson would eventually provide legal answers to those questions, but the moral complexity would divide Yazoo County for generations. Some would always see the Carter brothers as heroes who had finally stood up to corruption that everyone knew existed, but nobody had been willing to challenge. Others would remember them as killers who had destroyed 11 families over a dispute that should have been handled through proper channels. But everyone would agree on one thing. September 14, 1974, had changed everything. The night when 2 ordinary farmers decided that some violations of trust demanded blood payment, when honor and violence collided in a converted tobacco warehouse, when 11 men paid the ultimate price for being connected to predatory lending practices that the law couldn't or wouldn't address. The warehouse would stand empty for decades afterward, too heavy with history for anyone to occupy. Turner's family would eventually sell the property to developers who would tear down the building and construct something new, but locals would always remember what had happened there. The ground itself seemed cursed, soaked with blood spilled in the name of justice that looked exactly like revenge. The trial of James Lee Carter and Robert Franklin Carter began on March 18, 1975. 6 months after the massacre that had shocked the nation and divided a community along lines that would never fully heal. The federal courthouse in Jackson, 200 miles from Yazoo County, provided the neutral ground necessary for proceedings that couldn't possibly find impartial jurors in a region where everyone had known someone connected to the case. 22 combined capital charges faced the two brothers who sat at the defense table with the same calm resignation they had shown during their arrest. First-degree murder, 11 counts each, carrying penalties that could result in their execution or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The prosecution entered the courtroom with evidence so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from the opening statements. Federal prosecutors had confessions obtained immediately after arrest, with both brothers admitting their actions to FBI agents without attempting denial or fabrication. Forensic evidence linked them conclusively to every aspect of the massacre. Shell casings, ballistics reports, fingerprints, and timeline reconstruction created an airtight case that left no room for reasonable doubt about who had committed these crimes or when they had occurred. The defense team, two court-appointed attorneys from Jackson who appeared overwhelmed by the magnitude of their task, attempted to construct an argument based on temporary insanity brought about by extreme emotional distress. They painted a picture of desperate men pushed beyond human endurance by systematic fraud that had destroyed their family's legacy while legal authorities looked the other way. Character witnesses testified about James Carter's previous reputation as an honest veteran who had served his country with distinction in Vietnam. Neighbors spoke of his helpfulness during difficult times, his reliability in completing work commitments, his devotion to his dying father. Bobby Carter was described as a loving husband and father who had never shown violent tendencies outside this single catastrophic incident. The prosecution systematically demolished these arguments with surgical precision that left the defense looking foolish for even attempting such strategies. Temporary insanity required spontaneous action, triggered by immediate circumstances, not 5 days of methodical planning that included weapon acquisition, surveillance of targets, and coordination of attack strategies. The government's case methodically documented each step of the brothers' preparation, from James's visit to the Vicksburg pawn shop to purchase untraceable ammunition, through their surveillance of victim routines, to their careful mapping of escape routes and law enforcement response times. This wasn't madness triggered by unbearable stress, but calculated revenge disguised as frontier justice. Expert witnesses testified about the military precision evident in the attack's execution, the systematic elimination of witnesses, and the cold efficiency that spoke of extensive planning rather than emotional breakdown. The warehouse had been transformed into a killing ground through deliberate action, not spontaneous violence triggered by psychological collapse. The jury selection process had required weeks of careful questioning to identify 12 individuals who could evaluate the evidence without predetermined bias about rural justice or sympathy for desperate farmers. The final panel included urban professionals, suburban residents, and carefully screened rural dwellers who hadn't been personally affected by similar economic pressures. Deliberations lasted 9 hours over 2 days, time spent not determining guilt, which seemed obvious from the evidence, but wrestling with the moral complexities that surrounded the case. Every juror understood that the Carter brothers had committed mass murder, but many struggled with the circumstances that had driven them to such extremes. On March 27, 1975, the jury returned their inevitable verdict. Guilty on all charges, both defendants, with no recommendation for mercy despite the sympathetic circumstances that had motivated their crimes. The evidence simply couldn't support any other conclusion, regardless of how tragic the underlying situation had become. Sentencing came 3 weeks later, with Judge Harrison Mitchell delivering the maximum penalties allowed under federal law: death by execution for James Lee Carter, death by execution for Robert Franklin Carter. Sentences that reflected both the severity of their crimes and society's determination to maintain legal order regardless of individual grievances. James showed no visible emotion as his death sentence was pronounced, maintaining the same stoic expression he had worn throughout the trial proceedings. He had known from the moment he pulled the trigger on Deputy Marcus Webb that this path led inevitably to his own destruction, accepting that consequence as part of the price for defending his family's honor. Bobby cried openly in the courtroom, not from fear of his own fate, but from the crushing realization of what his actions had cost everyone he loved. Rita would raise Sammy alone, explaining to their son why his father would never come home, carrying the stigma of being married to a mass murderer for the rest of her life. The death sentences triggered automatic appeals that would wind through federal courts for 3 years before being commuted to life imprisonment without parole, when procedural issues invalidated Mississippi's capital punishment statutes. Both brothers would spend their remaining decades behind bars, carrying the weight of 11 lives and countless destroyed families. James Carter served 29 years at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, working in the prison carpentry shop where he taught woodworking skills to other inmates while maintaining the same quiet dignity that had characterized his civilian life. Guards described him as the most disciplined prisoner they had ever supervised, never complaining about conditions, never seeking special treatment, never causing trouble for anyone. Prison officials noted that James never received visitors during his first 5 years of incarceration, apparently cutting all ties with the outside world to spare his remaining family the burden of maintaining contact with a convicted mass murderer. He spent his time reading, working, and existing in the liminal space between life and death that long-term prisoners learn to navigate. Rita Carter visited Bobby religiously every month for 18 years, bringing Sammy until the boy reached 16 and refused to continue accompanying his mother to see a father he barely remembered outside prison walls. The weekly drives from Yazoo County to Parchman became a ritual of grief that defined her existence, choosing loyalty over the fresh start that remarriage might have provided. She never moved away from the community where the massacre had occurred, working her shifts at the local grocery store while raising her son alone and carrying a burden of shame that became part of her fundamental identity. Neighbors treated her with careful politeness that acknowledged her innocent status while maintaining emotional distance from someone connected to such notorious crimes. Sammy Carter grew up knowing his father was in prison, but understanding few details about the circumstances until reaching adolescence and discovering the truth through school friends whose families remembered the case. The knowledge that his father had killed 11 men over a gambling debt created psychological trauma that followed him into adulthood, affecting his ability to form relationships and trust authority figures. Samuel Carter died on October 4, 1974, 3 weeks after the massacre, never learning what his sons had done in his name. The medical bills that had triggered the predatory loan continued accumulating even after his death, eventually consuming what little remained of the family's resources and leaving nothing for James and Bobby's legal defense except court-appointed attorneys. The elderly man passed away believing his land had been stolen through legal fraud, but unaware that 11 people had been killed to avenge that theft. His funeral drew dozens of community members who remembered him as an honest farmer, destroyed by circumstances beyond his control, though many whispered about what his sons had done just days earlier. Lucky Haynes's widow Sharon moved to Memphis 6 months after the trial, taking their teenage daughters away from a community where their father's name had become synonymous with predatory corruption. She remarried within 3 years, desperate to create new identities for children who carried the burden of being related to the man whose greed had triggered the bloodiest massacre in Mississippi history. The daughters changed their surnames and moved to different states as soon as they reached adulthood, building lives completely disconnected from their father's legacy while carrying psychological scars that never fully healed. Both women struggled with relationships and trust issues that stemmed from learning their father had been a criminal whose actions had destroyed multiple families. Deputy Marcus Webb's widow, Martha, remained in Yazoo County but never spoke publicly about her husband's connection to illegal gambling operations or his acceptance of bribes from Lucky Haynes. She raised their 3 children alone, quietly accepting community support while privately struggling with the knowledge that Marcus had compromised his professional integrity for money. One of her sons eventually joined law enforcement himself, perhaps attempting to redeem his father's tarnished reputation or simply following familiar career patterns. He served with distinction for over 20 years, earning respect that partially offset the shame associated with his family name. Vernon Tucker's family fled Mississippi entirely, moving to Oregon, where they attempted to build new lives far from the scene of tragedy that had claimed their husband and father. Emma Tucker remarried within 2 years, choosing survival over extended mourning while helping her young sons forget their connection to the massacre. The other victim families scattered like wind-blown leaves, each coping with loss according to their individual circumstances and psychological resources. Some stayed in the community and gradually rebuilt their lives, while others moved away seeking fresh starts in places where their names carried no historical baggage. Turner's warehouse remained empty for decades after the massacre, standing as an unofficial monument to the night when frontier justice had collided with federal law in rural Mississippi. No one would rent the building despite reasonable asking prices, and local teenagers avoided the property entirely, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of men who had died violently. The structure finally burned down in 1998 under circumstances that investigators suspected were arson but could never prove conclusively. Local residents expressed relief rather than sadness about losing a landmark that reminded everyone of their community's darkest moment, preferring to let nature reclaim the land where so much blood had been spilled. James Lee Carter died of heart failure on November 3, 2003, at age 63 in the prison infirmary at 4:22 in the morning. The chaplain on duty reported that his final coherent words involved asking about his father, wondering whether Samuel had ever learned what his sons had done to avenge the theft of their family land. He was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple marker that listed only his name and dates of birth and death, with no mention of his military service, his family relationships, or the circumstances that had brought him to that final resting place. The grave remains unmarked by flowers or visitors, a forgotten reminder of choices that had destroyed multiple generations. Robert Franklin Carter remains incarcerated at Parchman as of 2024, now 79 years old, and serving the 49th year of his life sentence without possibility of parole. Sammy visits twice yearly, maintaining minimal contact with a father he barely remembers outside prison walls while struggling with the psychological burden of their shared history. In rare interviews granted to documentary filmmakers, Bobby speaks carefully about the decisions that destroyed his life and his family's future. He acknowledges following his brother's lead without fully considering the consequences, expressing regret for the pain inflicted on innocent family members while stopping short of condemning the actions that had seemed necessary at the time. Rita Carter died of cancer in 2018 at age 74, having spent 44 years as a widow whose husband remained alive but permanently separated from their family. Bobby was denied permission to attend her funeral, leaving him to grieve alone in his cell while their son handled burial arrangements and final affairs. The community of Yazoo County changed permanently after September 14, 1974, though those changes proved temporary as new residents arrived who had no knowledge of local history. For several years following the massacre, neighbors helped each other more openly. Debts were forgiven more readily, and disputes were settled before they could escalate into violence. Banks became slightly more lenient in their lending practices, conscious of the potential consequences when desperate families faced financial destruction. Local law enforcement paid closer attention to reports of fraud or predatory business practices, understanding that community stability required addressing grievances before they reached the breaking point. But human nature proved stronger than historical memory as time passed, and direct participants moved away or died. Within a decade, the same economic pressures that had destroyed the Carter family began affecting new residents who had never heard of Lucky Haynes or the brothers who had killed 11 men to avenge their father's humiliation. Sheriff Tom Beckworth never sought re-election after serving his final term in 1976, telling supporters that the job had changed too much for his comfort, or that perhaps he had changed too much to continue serving effectively. He died in 1988 at age 69, reportedly suffering nightmares about Turner's warehouse until the end of his life. FBI Special Agent Harold Briggs retired in 1994 after 36 years of federal service that had included investigating civil rights murders, organized crime activities, and domestic terrorism cases. In interviews conducted years later, he described the Carter case as the most morally complex investigation of his career, involving clear criminal guilt accompanied by understandable motivations. The agent acknowledged that legally the brothers were mass murderers who deserved their sentences, while morally they were desperate men who had been systematically victimized by predators operating within legal boundaries. The contradiction between law and justice in this case continued troubling him decades after retirement, representing questions that had no satisfying answers. The story of the Mississippi Blood Oath contains no heroes, only human beings pushed beyond their breaking points by circumstances that expose the failures of systems designed to protect honest families from sophisticated criminals. It demonstrates what happens when legal remedies prove inadequate to address systematic fraud, when law enforcement lacks resources or willingness to investigate complex financial crimes, when communities allow predators to operate freely among vulnerable populations. James and Bobby Carter crossed boundaries that civilized society cannot permit anyone to cross, regardless of provocation or justification. They eliminated 11 people through premeditated violence that represented the complete breakdown of legal and moral order. Their actions terrorized an entire community while destroying families on both sides of the conflict. Yet their crimes emerged from genuine victimization by sophisticated fraudsters who used legal paperwork as weapons against people lacking education or resources to defend themselves adequately. The predatory lending practices that destroyed Samuel Carter were entirely legal under Mississippi law, protected by contracts that few farmers could understand and fewer still could afford to challenge in court. The questions raised by the Mississippi Massacre of 1974 remain as troubling today as they were 50 years ago. What happens when the legal system fails to protect decent families from sophisticated predators? How far should ordinary people go when faced with systematic theft disguised as legitimate business? Where exactly is the line between justified resistance and unforgivable violence? James and Bobby Carter became mass murderers the night they walked into Turner's warehouse, eliminating 11 men in cold blood over what they believed was stolen honor. But they also became symbols of what happens when desperate people conclude that legal channels offer no protection against criminals who operate within the boundaries of law. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the price we pay when systems designed to protect the innocent instead shield the guilty. The warehouse may be gone, the victims long buried, and most of the participants dead or forgotten, but the fundamental questions persist. In forgotten corners of America, families still face impossible choices between accepting systematic victimization or taking matters into their own hands. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the moral complexity remains unchanged. If this story made you think about justice, honor, and the breaking points that transform ordinary people into something unrecognizable, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong. Comment below with your thoughts on where the line should be drawn between victim and villain. Because somewhere tonight another family is being pushed toward their own breaking point, and the question of what they'll choose to become when that moment arrives remains as relevant as ever.